The plaza's grand ballroom in Midtown hummed like a beehive, crystal tinkling against crystal, whispered deals disguised as compliments, expensive perfumes swirling over old money and new ambition. It was the Sinclair Family Foundation's annual gala, the high point of my husband Devin's family calendar, and the room was stacked with surnames that opened doors. I stood alone beside a marble column, clutching a champagne flute that had gone flat, like my mood. I felt like a striking sculpture placed in the wrong gallery, glanced at, never really seen. My dress, a custom emerald silk I'd obsessed over for weeks, dripped elegance, which only made the stiffness in my posture more obvious. In that room, I wasn't Aisha Tinsley, award-winning architect, studio founder, builder of my own name. I was simply Devin's wife. My identity, years in the making, disappeared beneath the heavier shadow of his last name, Sinclair. Across the room, Devin basked in the light of his own orbit, holding court among older men in tailoring that probably cost more than my first car. He threw his head back, laughing a shade too loud at a joke that didn't land for anyone else. His gaze swept the ballroom, touched mine, and flickered into a quick, practiced smile, more tick than warmth, before he turned back to the crowd. That flicker was a ration of attention I'd learned to live on for 5 years. Aisha, darling, stop lurking behind stonework. Lorraine's voice, a blade wrapped in velvet, sliced into my thoughts. People will think you don't appreciate our generosity. Her smile was stretched tight by surgical precision. Her lipstick was a warning light. She gripped my arm with surprising force and steered me toward the main table as if I'd wandered off script. The head table was theatrical excess, an imperial sprawl of white orchids spilling over heavy silver candelabra, place cards gleaming under candlelight, names in immaculate script: Sinclair, Beaumont, Sterling. At the top sat Devin's card. Beside it, an empty seat. A foolish little spark of hope bloomed. Maybe tonight, after my quiet, substantial donation, they'd finally give me a place at the table, if not in the family. I stood a single step toward the empty chair. Lorraine's hand tightened around my forearm like a vice. "Oh, no, dear," she murmured. The volume said whisper. The tone said public address. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. This table is reserved for family and our principal benefactors. Appearances are everything." She paused, savoring the moment, the audience of nearby ears. "Support staff and assistants have a lovely spread in the service corridor. I'm sure you understand." The room didn't go quiet. If anything, the sound sharpened. Conversations peeked into little needles of curiosity, and I could feel at least a dozen eyes attached to my skin, some pitying, most hungry. I looked for Devin, just a glance, just a plea of, "Don't let this happen." He had seen, he had heard each syllable. For a heartbeat, panic flashed across his face. Not on my behalf, at the inconvenience. Then something else took its place. Relief, a crooked lift of one corner of his mouth, almost a sneer. He gave the subtlest shrug, as if this were a harmless little joke, and he laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, not a smoothing over laugh, a short, low, cruel laugh that said, "Finally, you're in your place." He turned to the man beside him. My mother and her protocols, you know how she is. And the man stared at his plate, embarrassed for him, if not for me. Bullets are mercifully quick. This wasn't a bullet. It was slow poison seeping cold through my chest until I could feel it in my fingertips. Whatever scraps of love I'd clung to froze and cracked. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. They expected that. It would have confirmed the story they tell about me. I lifted my chin, met Lorraine's frosted, triumphant gaze, and smiled, serene, almost saintly. "Of course," I said, voice steady and clear. "I understand perfectly." I turned and walked, not fast, not with flustered steps, deliberate, measured. The tap of my heels on polished marble set a quiet funeral march. As I reached the ballroom doors, Lorraine's voice, like a knife dipped in honey, rose behind me. As I was saying, the new wing is in desperate need of funding. Her performance resumed as if I'd never stood there.
I left the sound of her and the image of my husband's laugh suspended behind me like bad art. Humiliation didn't burn anymore. It calcified into something clean and hard, fuel.
The silence inside my Mercedes felt like a chapel. I merged onto the 110 and let the freeway sweep me over Los Angeles, lights bleeding into a kaleidoscope through dry eyes. I didn't replay the scene. That would be like picking at an open wound. Instead, my mind opened a private museum, a quiet place where every slight, every cutting remark lived on its own little pedestal. I walked through it in my head. First was the exhibit I always visited with reference, The Hidden Legacy. I was 19, sitting beside my grandfather's hospital bed, his hand, rough and shaking, wrapped around mine. "Money can build houses," he rasped. "Not homes. It can buy loyalty, not love." He tapped my forehead, then my chest. "I'm leaving you the tools to build anything you want. Promise me you won't let anyone, not even the man you love, make you feel small." Days after we buried him, his lawyer, Sterling J. Davis, unfolded a trust across a mahogany desk, hundreds of millions placed in my hands alone. "He saw your integrity," Sterling said, eyes kind and firm. "Everyone else saw a finish line. He saw your starting line. He trusted you to grow it." Next gallery, The Early Love, lit warmly enough to disguise the cracks. Devin, back in architecture school, magnetic, brilliant on the surface, dark eyes full of big future. He had no money. He had audacity. I fell for the promise and the plan. Over coffee in Silver Lake, when I told him about the inheritance, his eyes flashed in a way I mistook for partnership. "We can do anything, Aisha, together." I wanted together to be true so badly that I made it true all by myself. Along an entire wall, the company that wasn't. I drafted his consulting firm's business plan. 50 pages I researched, wrote, polished. He kissed me like gratitude. I know now it was transaction. Through a holding company Sterling structured, I funded everything. Corner office with a view, first hires, premium travel to woo clients. Legally, I held 80%. Quietly, I was the foundation. Publicly, it was his company. At dinners, he'd say, "When I started my firm," and I'd smile, the supportive ornament. "When my studio began winning national awards," he called it "your little hobby. Glad you're keeping busy, sweetheart." Each pat on the hand, a paper cut, bleeding unseen. The largest room, the house that betrayed me. The Bel Air mansion. I poured a year of my life into every line and finish. Light-drenched spaces, warm modernity, a home that felt like breath. The day we moved in, Lorraine swept through with decorators. "A palace for you, Devin," she declared, gliding past me. "It just needs a lady's touch." Heavy drapes smothered sunlight. Brand-name sofas ignored comfort. Pompous art replaced the bold, emerging voices I'd curated. When I protested, trembling, Devin led me to the library. "Aisha, don't make drama. It's decor. Let my mother have fun. She feels this house is hers too." That sentence echoed for years. Her house, then his house, never ours. I'd built a dream only to be treated like an honored visitor. I walked those halls in my head, and for the first time, the ache was gone. Devin's laugh wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was the capstone on 5 years of carefully layered contempt. My grandfather had given me tools to build a good life. Blinded by love, I used them to erect a palace for my own jailer. He'd also handed me something else, a master key. I turned off the freeway and headed toward Bel Air. For the first time all night, I had a destination, my property. It was time to start the teardown. The mansion recognized me with a soft electronic click. What had once sounded like welcome now felt like the lock sliding back on a cell door. I stepped into the dark foyer, where the perfume of fresh orchids, Lorraine's insistence every 3 days, hung thick in the air. My heels echoed off marble I had chosen, in a house I had drawn that no longer resembled anything I loved. I left the main lights off. Moonlight spilled through the tall panes that framed the garden I designed. Silvery hints of lawn, shadowed hedges, the faint gleam of water along the pool's edge. Everywhere I looked, I saw their fingerprints. A ludicrous Qing vase in the entry, her purchase. An enormous oil of Devon,
looming over the living room like a minor monarch, his gift to himself. The space didn't breathe. It pulsed. I climbed the sweeping stair and headed straight to my studio, my harbor, the one room that still belonged to me. Devin avoided it. He claimed the scent of graphite, wood models, and stale coffee gave him a headache. To me, that was the smell of creation. I shut the solid door and let the quiet settle. A small mid-century lamp cast a cone of warm light onto my desk, illuminating the current project. Clean lines of a boutique hotel in Miami Beach. For a moment, my mind slipped into the refuge of form and proportion. Not tonight. Tonight was demolition.
I knelt by the built-in shelves and ran my fingers along a familiar spine. Richard Neutra's collected works. Only this volume didn't hold paper. I pressed a hidden switch. A narrow panel slid aside, exposing a keypad. I typed a date engraved into my bones. October 8th, 1930, my grandfather's birthday. The safe opened with reassuring weight. Inside lay jewelry I rarely wore and a zippered black folio. I set it on the walnut surface and unzipped it. Trust documents, holding company bylaws, deeds, financing agreements, the operating manual of my freedom. The landline sat beside it, patient. My heartbeat stayed steady. The woman who had left the plaza bruised by humiliation was gone. In her place sat an architect ready to execute a controlled implosion, measuring charges, marking load points, checking the fall path twice. Before dialing, I opened a drawer and pulled out our wedding album. Linen cover faded at the edges. The first image? San Miguel de Allende. Sunlight. Cobblestones. Two people smiling like they knew something the world didn't. I remembered heat on my shoulders, the burn of celebratory scotch, the grip of a hand I believed would protect. I didn't feel sad. I felt a distant tenderness for the girl in the photo, the one who thought love could persuade character to change. She'd survived. Now she would reclaim what she should have had all along. The album closed with a quiet thud, period at the end of a chapter. I dialed Sterling's private line. He picked up on the second ring. Aisha, he said, voice low and unruffled, as if he'd been expecting the call for 5 years. Aisha, Sterling, sorry for the hour. It's never too late for what's right, he said. Are you ready? I'm better than ready, I said, surprised at how true it felt. It's time. A beat. Solemn, not hesitant. I could see him in my mind's eye, surrounded by leather spines and case law, nodding once. You understand, once we set this in motion, there's no pause button. Completely, I said, glancing at the folio. Activate the legacy protocol. Understood. He replied, tone shifting into the precise cadence of a surgeon before an operation. At first light, the machinery moves. Everything has been prepared. We needed your word. Thank you, I said. Get some rest if you can, he added gently. Tomorrow, you start building. I eased the receiver into its cradle. The studio's silence held me. No rush of triumph, no crackle of revenge. Just an immense level quiet, the kind you feel when the countdown reaches 0 and the structure starts to give exactly where you meant it to. Dawn blushed at the edge of the city when I pulled into Century City's underground garage. At 7, the glass towers were waking, baristas steaming milk, elevators yawning open, the first wave of power ties making for their floors. This was Devin's playground. Today, I was here as owner. Sterling met me in the lobby, dressed for work that mattered. Tweed sweater, corduroys, not a performance in sight. Coffee's hot, paperwork's laid out, he said, with a small smile that didn't dilute his focus. We took the private lift to the 40th floor. The view swept from the hills to the ocean, but my eyes locked on the conference table. Sleek glass, 3 ivory folders centered like movements in a symphony. Devin's unraveling had been orchestrated. All that remained was the downbeat. Before you sign, Sterling said, pouring coffee into a heavy mug, know exactly what you're wielding. He opened the first folder. The trust. Your grandfather had a generous heart and a sober view of human nature, he said. He assumed money could warp behavior. He asked me to include a clause, airtight, tested, cruelly clear. He slid a page forward, one paragraph highlighted. Any secondary beneficiary who publicly humiliates, emotionally abuses, or deliberately dishonors the primary beneficiary forfeits access and rights to all trust-derived assets. Immediate,
irrevocable. He looked up. Last night wasn't merely poor manners, Aisha. In legal terms, it was breach. We already have 4 willing witnesses, including Marcus Albright. Called me at 6 this morning. A coolness moved through me. Recognition, not doubt. My grandfather hadn't only left me wealth. He left me safeguards and a blade. Execution, Sterling said, moving to the second movement, happens in 3 simultaneous strikes. Swift, surgical, defensible. He slid a stack of notices toward me. At 9:01 a.m., with your signature, the banks freeze every account tied to the trust. All cards in Devin and Lorraine's names, corporate extensions, die on the spot. Vehicle leases cease. In short, shut the valves. The pen felt weighty in my hand. The ink cut a clean line. With each signature, a pipe somewhere stopped hissing.
Folder 2. Bylaws for Sinclair Consultants. Through Tinsley Investments, you hold 80%, Sterling said. You can call an emergency meeting at will. This resolution sets one for 11 a.m. The sole agenda item, removal of the CEO for loss of confidence and reputational risk. Can the minority block it? I asked out of habit. He smiled. This time, it reached his eyes. No, this is a lawful majority action. The severance is pre-drafted, generous enough to withstand scrutiny, narrow enough to end his reach. I signed. The knot in my stomach loosened by a notch. This was a necessary cut to save the rest. The third folder was thin and final. The deed to Bel Air. Title sits under Tinsley, Sterling said. Devin's occupancy existed by usufruct, contingent on the marriage, and crucially, on compliance with the trust. He violated the condition evaporates. He placed the eviction notice where my hand would naturally fall. A notary delivers at 10. 48 hours to remove personal effects. If he refuses, the sheriff enforces. He won't. Too public. My signature flowed one last time. There it was. The score was marked. The baton lifted. What now? I asked quietly. Now, Sterling said, closing the folders carefully, you go to your studio. Put on whatever album you design to. Do the work you love. Let me handle the debris removal. By the time I hit Wilshire, the city had fully engaged. Signals green and red in their turns, lanes doing what lanes do. For the first time in years, my life felt similarly organized. Pieces finally aligned, contingencies in place. The end game committed. When I walked into the kitchen, Miss Jenkins, gracious, discreet, and observant, was polishing glassware. She took one look at me and offered a gentle nod. Good morning, Miss Aisha. Tea, please, I said, returning her smile. I'll sleep tonight. I carried my jasmine tea to the dining table overlooking the garden. A hummingbird hung, darted, sipped. I waited. At 10:15, Devin breezed in, whistling off-key. He tossed his briefcase into a chair, wearing the smugness of a man who believed he'd finally put his wife in her place. He expected wreckage. He was looking for tears.
Aisha, he began, equal parts annoyed and paternal. I hope you're done with last night's tantrum. My mother is old school, and you— The doorbell split his sentence. Miss Jenkins answered. A notary stepped in. Charcoal suit, leather portfolio, neutral face. I need Mr. Devin Sinclair to sign for personal service, he said. Devin blinked. For me? From whom? Sign here, the notary replied, offering a pen and ignoring the question. Devin scrawled, shut the door, and tore into the envelope. His eyes skipped ahead, then slowed, then snapped wide like someone who'd been doused in ice. What is this garbage? He spat, color draining from his face. Eviction? 48 hours? Are you insane? His phone vibrated violently. He stabbed the screen. What? He barked. Devin! Sophia's voice shook through the speaker. The board just called an emergency meeting in 30 minutes to vote you out. It says, by order of the majority shareholder. Who was the majority? He stared at the wall. The phone pressed to his ear like it might draw blood. Then he lowered it, looking at me as understanding crashed into place. It was you. Tinsley Investments. Mine. And my grandfather's legacy. His face twisted. Fury and disbelief warring. You can't do this. I built that company. You fronted it. I funded it, structured it, and shielded it. The foundation has decided the superstructure is compromised. We're taking it down before it falls on everyone else. His cell rang again. He glanced at the screen and hurled the phone against the wall. It shattered. Amex. Canceled. He started pacing, hands in his hair, like a caged animal discovering the bars for the first time. This is about a stupid thing my mother said? You're destroying me over etiquette?
No, I said,
voice surgical. You destroyed yourself. Years of small cuts, of letting your mother carve me up in front of you, of calling my work a hobby, of shrinking me to make space for yourself. That was masonry. Last night wasn't a quip. It was your signature. You completed the wall that boxed you in. He looked very young suddenly. Panicked. Lost. What do you want, Aisha? Money? I'll give you anything. We can fix it. It's already fixed, I said. I'm keeping my house, my company, and my name, and I'm removing you from them. The front door swung open mid-sentence. Lorraine stormed in, face blotched, eyes wild. Devin, why have my cards stopped working? I was humiliated at Neiman's in front of everyone. She saw the suitcases by the door. She saw his ashy face. She saw me, calm as a lake. What is this? She croaked. Devin couldn't speak. He pointed at the paper on the floor. She snatched it, scanned the first paragraph, and went utterly white. For the first time since I'd known her, Lorraine Sinclair had no words. The curtain rose. The show began. Lorraine stood frozen, eviction notice trembling in her manicured hand. Her mouth opened, then shut again, like a fish suddenly yanked out of water. For once, the woman who always had a script had nothing to say. Devin scrambled for control, dialing, redialing, firing off texts with thumbs that couldn't find traction. The minority investors answered with the hollow politeness of people already moving on. The emergency board session began on video at 11 sharp. Sterling appeared on screen, measured, unflappable, representing the majority shareholder. The resolution was read. The vote was quick. It wasn't a debate. It was paperwork catching up to reality. By 11:30 a.m., Devin was no longer CEO of the firm that wore his surname like a borrowed tuxedo. The blast rippled through their curated world. It didn't spread like gossip. It detonated. Lorraine's phone, which until yesterday buzzed with invitations and flattery, turned to dead air. The women who'd smirked at my humiliation the night before suddenly discovered urgent calls across the room when they saw her, or stepped off the curb to avoid the collision. Devin's text swung between pleading and venom. You did this to me. Aisha, please, we can fix. You'll regret this. Until the bank cut off service for non-payment. I didn't answer. I did what I do when everything tilts. I worked. I shut my personal phone in a drawer, turned on music in my studio, and spread out the drawings for the Miami Beach Hotel. I lost myself in proportion and light, in the alchemy of materials and story. Cypress, terrazzo, woven cane, ocean breezes, and shadows that move like theater across a lobby wall. Creation felt like oxygen after months of stale air. Mid-afternoon, my intercom pinged. Miss Tinsley, Marcus Albright from Albright Hospitality is on line 1. He says it's personal. I hesitated. His face had been among the ones that looked away at the gala, but picked up. Aisha, he said, voice warm and unapologetically sincere. First, I owe you an apology. What we witnessed last night was indefensible. Your composure under that vulgarity was extraordinary. Thank you, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my tone. Second, business, he continued. I've followed your studio for years. We were prepping a design competition for 3 boutique hotels: Palm Springs, Charleston, the Virgin Islands. This morning, I told our board there will be no competition. We want your firm, exclusively, if you're interested. For a beat, I just listened to the sound of my own breath. The timing was so precise, it felt like a story I might have written and decided against for being too neat. I am, I said at last, honored. Actually, drafts will be in your inbox by close of business. Then, softer, integrity wins. Sometimes it takes the scenic route. I hung up and stared at my hands, ink smudged on my middle finger from sketching. Outside the studio window, a moving truck rumbled to the curb. 2 men hopped down and lowered the ramp. Devin's domain was being flattened into cardboard and bubble wrap, exactly as the world he'd curated was collapsing into whispers and silence. He stomped through the foyer, tossing suits into open boxes, barking into a borrowed phone. Miss Jenkins hovered like a lighthouse, steady and compassionate, never stepping into the storm. Lorraine reappeared just before dusk, hair askew, mascara blurred. She wasn't a tyrant then. She was a person who had forgotten how to be small. We lost everything, she whispered, not looking at me. The name, the respect. You lost access,
I corrected gently. You never had what you thought you did. She lifted bloodshot eyes, searching for a crack. Was it worth it? Ruining my son, your husband, over a bruised ego? It wasn't ego, I said, stepping closer. It was respect. You've never understood it because you think it's demanded. It's earned. And yes, worth it. Down to the last second. Her mouth trembled. She turned and left without another word, flagging down a taxi, an unfamiliar gesture for a woman accustomed to back seats and drivers who knew her coffee order. By nightfall, the truck was gone. The house breathed. Finally, empty of sound, heavy with possibility. I stood in the dim and didn't feel the old chill. The silence wasn't punishment anymore. It was a blank page. And I, at last, held the pen. A month slid by, measured not in days, but in changes. The house, my house, shed its costume. Lorraine's heavy velvet drapes came down first, along with the performative silk tassels that had always made me think of theater curtains. I donated the brocade sofas to a charity that furnishes transitional housing. Someone else could sit on them and tell a better story. The ludicrous king vase left in a padded crate, bound for auction. I took a quiet, private pleasure in signing the release forms. In their place came pieces that breathed, soft linen, warm oak, coils of hand-woven grass baskets that held the light rather than fighting it. I rehung the art wall with work by living artists whose voices I believed in, canvas that pulsed with color and intention. The enormous oil of Devon presiding over the living room was replaced by a fierce, layered abstract from Eliza Kincaid, brushstrokes that felt like weather systems moving across a map. I stood back from it and felt my lungs open. I pulled up the rug in the dining room and let the terrazzo floor shine. The fireplace, a cold monument, got a new purpose. Stacked ceramics from a young maker in Echo Park, matte glazes like river stones. The library survived the purge with a gentler hand. I added a reading chair by the window and left the shelves to their work. My studio expanded into the spare bedroom across the hall. Flat files and model tables blooming into the space like it had been waiting for them. I kept the Nelson lamp and added a battered drafting stool from a flea market, the wood worn smooth by someone else's work long ago. Miss Jenkins called it the heart of the house now, and I didn't argue. Work surged. Marcus's team moved quickly. Term sheets arrived with clean terms and clean respect. I assembled a project pod for each hotel. One lead, 2 juniors, an interiors partner, and a project manager who could hold 10 threads without losing track of any. I hired 2 recent UCLA grads with bright minds and sharpened pencils, and an interiors lead whose eye could find harmony between a hand-woven textile and a slab of oiled walnut without trying too hard. We took the old downtown studio and doubled it, knocked down a wall, added skylights, rolled out new cork flooring that felt good under tired feet. Plants appeared, trailing pothos and a ridiculous fiddle leaf fig that somehow loved the light. The name on the glass door stayed the same. The energy inside it didn't. I flew to Palm Springs, then Charleston, then the Virgin Islands in a dizzying loop the second week. I walked dry washes lined with creosote and listened to locals talk about mid-century lines that still felt right in desert sun. I traced my fingers over worn heart pine in a Charleston townhouse and sat under live oaks listening to stories about porches and heat and slow afternoons that still mattered. I stood at the edge of a Caribbean shoreline and sketched palm shade patterns into a notebook, salt drying on my forearms. At night, in hotel rooms, I lined my finds along the seal, shell fragments, a piece of weathered wood, a scrap of indigo, and drew until exhaustion overruled ambition. Back home, the team translated those quick lines into plans. We pinned up, critiqued, iterated, laughed too loud, and remembered to go home before midnight most nights. The mansion felt different when I returned from each trip, lighter. It smelled like coffee and jasmine tea and sawdust from a small project I'd insisted on doing myself. Built-in benches along the kitchen windows for morning sun. Miss Jenkins rolled her eyes at my insistence on sanding, then handed me a mask and set the vacuum beside me without comment. One afternoon, while sorting mail at the kitchen island, I found a letter addressed in careful, unfamiliar script. The return address was a cheap law firm in a part of town where rents were lower and compromise lived close to the surface. I slit the envelope open with a butter knife. Devin. It wasn't a suit. It was a plea, handwritten, verbose, and crowded with self-pity. He listed his losses: a small rental in the valley, a job search that went nowhere, the humiliation of going from whispered reservations to waiting rooms. He called what happened at the gala a terrible error of one night, as if it were an isolated storm and not the season that had preceded it. He asked for help. He asked me to remember our good years, which had evaporated on closer inspection. He asked for money. I read it twice, searching for something like remorse that included me, not just his circumstances. I didn't find it. What I felt surprised me. Not anger, not triumph, nothing. It was like handling a photograph of a stranger someone insisted I'd once known. Still, closure is a door you open for yourself. I emailed Sterling 2 lines. I'll meet him. Neutral ground, 1 hour, no promises. Back in the studio, Eliza Kincaid's painting glowed gently in the late light. I set Devin's letter under a paper weight and went back to Palm Springs. Cool roofs, deep overhangs, a courtyard that breathed even when the wind didn't. The life that used to swallow me was receding like a tide. Under my feet, something new was setting up like concrete, curing properly this time because I hadn't rushed the mix. We met in a crowded coffee shop in Larchmont Village. No dim corners for melodrama, just clatter and chatter and the hiss of steamed milk. Neutral ground. Devin arrived on time, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. He had lost weight. The easy arrogance had thinned into a skittish energy, fingers tapping, eyes skimming the room as if he could locate the exit to a different version of his life. "Thanks for meeting me, Aisha," he said, reaching for a nickname he hadn't used in years. "Miss Tinsley," I corrected gently. The barista called out a name, cups hit a tray. The world kept moving. He launched into his monologue. How hard everything had become, how unfair, how much this one incident had cost him, how his mother was now answering phones at a dental clinic in the suburbs. He tried to conjure the good years, polishing them until they gleamed, hoping I'd mistake the shine for truth. I listened, like an architect assessing a cracked beam, patient, thorough, refusing to pretend the damage wasn't there. When he ran out of words, silence settled, a real one. What you did that night wasn't a slip. A slip is spilling coffee. You made a choice. You aligned with your mother's cruelty over your wife's dignity. And that laugh wasn't a nervous tick. It was your signature on that choice. His eyes dropped. He said quietly, "I know. I'm sorry."
"I'm glad you are," I replied. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Forgiveness lets me move forward. It doesn't let you go back." I took an envelope from my bag and slid it across the table. His gaze sharpened with a fragile hope. "There's a check for $50,000. I said. "It isn't charity. Consider it a final severance for 5 years of my life invested in a project that failed. It's enough to start over. Maybe in a new city. It's not enough to forget what earning your way feels like." He stared at the envelope, unsure if picking it up was surrender or salvation. I stood. "I hope you build something real someday," I said, "for yourself." Outside, the afternoon was bright and ordinary. As I walked under the ficus trees lining the boulevard, I felt a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying slide off my shoulders. Not anger, not triumph. The responsibility I'd long felt for him just let go. Back home, the house met me with soft light and the scent of jasmine tea. Eliza Kincaid's painting threw a gentle storm across the living room. In my studio, the Miami Beach plans waited. Lines, ratios, decisions. Work brought me back to myself the way it always had. That night, I slept straight through till morning. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Work that expanded to fill me up, and a home that gave back more than it took. Mornings began with sunlight flooding the kitchen benches I'd built under the windows, jasmine tea steaming in my hands, Miss Jenkins humming to a Motown playlist while she wiped down the counters. The house had a sound now. Pencils scratching, printers spooling, the soft thump of packages arriving from fabric mills and lighting studios. Even the quiet between those sounds felt warm.
At the studio, the projects grew into themselves. For Palm Springs, We kept the lines clean and the overhangs deep, leaning into shade and breeze rather than fighting the sun. In Charleston, we mapped a courtyard sequence that allowed the air to move like a living thing, cool and slow, the way porches taught it to. For the Virgin Islands, we designed around the trade winds first, then everything else. Louvered shutters, rain chains, coral stone under bare feet. We brought in local artisans on every site, blacksmiths, basket weavers, tile makers, people whose hands carry memory. The team found its gait and then its joy. Someone taped a silly pun of the week above the sample wall. Another started an unofficial best lunch in a 5-block radius list. Pinups were vigorous but not cruel. Mistakes were owned and fixed. Wins were shared. At night, I would walk my house the way a sailor walks a deck. The living room's new abstract would gather the day's light into a slow storm and pour it across the floor. The library would smell like old paper and cedar. The studio's Nelson lamp would make a perfect circle of gold on tracing paper. I'd pause at a window, watch the garden I'd designed sway in the evening breeze, and think not about what had been taken, but about what I was building. Devon's world kept shrinking, but I didn't chase the updates. Now and then a piece of gossip slipped under my door, a resigned board seat here, a returned tuxedo there. Someone mentioned Lorraine working a front desk in a dental office in a neighborhood she used to avoid. I didn't file the details. I let them pass like weather. My silence did what I needed it to do. It kept the past in the past. Occasionally, an invitation arrived addressed to Mrs. Sinclair. Miss Jenkins would leave it at the bottom of the mail stack without comment. I'd slide it into the shredder and watch it turn to confetti. The machine made a low, efficient sound. Final. Unceremonious. Sterling checked in once a week, not to rehash, just to confirm that the structures we'd put in place were doing what structures do, bearing load. Boring is good, he'd say when the updates were short. I'd laugh and tell him work was not boring at all, not this side of the fire break. One Friday near sunset, I found myself sitting on the steps that lead from the terrace down to the lawn, blueprints temporarily forgotten, a mug going cold beside me. The garden lights clicked on one by one, soft as fireflies. For a long time, I thought peace would announce itself with trumpets. It didn't. It arrived like this, on bare feet, late to the party, entirely sure of itself. Inside, my phone chimed with an email from Marcus's office. Schedules, permits, and a line that made my pulse skip. Palm Springs grand opening? 6 weeks. I sat very still and let that sink in. Years ago, I told a 19-year-old version of myself that a home is different from a house. Now I knew the same thing applied to a life. The foundation I had carefully poured beneath everyone else was finally under my own feet. I pressed my palms flat to the warm stone step and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and fuss about a soffit detail in Charleston and argue with the vendor about back-ordered sconces for the Virgin Islands. I'd stand at a job site and clap my hands when a beam dropped in perfectly on the first try. I'd come home and eat dinner at my table without anyone keeping score. Tonight, I let myself sit in the middle of what I'd made and just breathe. The countdown to Palm Springs moved like a metronome. Predictable, relentless, strangely soothing. Every day had a rhythm. Site check at dawn, calls with vendors, details, details, details. On Tuesdays, I'd walk the site with the GC before the heat set in. Hard hat shading my eyes while crews set steel and electricians threaded conduit like music through the skeleton. We argued about a soffit line until it resolved itself into something better than either of us had sketched. We stood quietly for a minute when the first long beam dropped into place on the first try, a clean, perfect fit, and let ourselves grin like kids. Midweek meant pulling samples under true light. We lined up coral stone against bleached oak, whitewash beside salt, stiff linen, a dozen whites that all swore they were different. The interior's lead pulled a bolt of hand-dyed indigo from a local studio, and we all stopped talking. That, someone said. We nodded, unanimous. Fridays became the day of lists. What had been solved? What needed fresh eyes? What was in motion and would stay that way if we didn't lean on it? We hacked our way through back-ordered fixtures and a customs delay that threatened to derail an entire suite of hardware. Then found the metalsmith 3 neighborhoods over
who made something better with his hands and a small forge. The studio started to hum at a higher frequency. An industry blog picked up a photo from our Palm Springs framing day and called us the firm to watch. A glossy magazine profiled the woman rebuilding modern hospitality with honesty and air. I sent the links to my team with a single line, "This is us." They responded with emojis and then got back to work. The only wall we put the press on was by the bathroom.
At home, life had its own rituals. Miss Jenkins laughed out loud at an episode of a show I'd never watched and insisted I sit for one. Just one. I made a mess of a new pasta recipe and we ate the salvage on the terrace, watching the sky turn from gold to bruised blue. I set a vase of cut branches by Eliza Kincaid's painting and liked how the shadows complicated each other. Sterling's weekly calls got shorter. "Frameworks holding, nothing to report," he'd say. "Good," I'd answer, and we'd both mean it. 2 weeks out, we had the punch list that tells you you're almost there. Door swings, cabinet pulls, a stubborn drip in a line that shouldn't have been stubborn. The courtyard plantings arrived, a palette of desert greens and silvers that made the stucco sing. Someone made the joke about sweating small stuff, and someone else threw a rolled up set at them. On a quiet Sunday, I walked the house with a mug in my hand and realized I was doing it without bracing. The place held me instead of asking to be held. I paused in the library and pulled down a book at random. Inside was a forgotten museum ticket stub from a trip I'd taken by myself years ago. I slid it back where I'd found it and smiled. The woman who wandered museums alone had come with me into this new life. I was glad. A calendar notification pinged. Palm Springs opening, 12 days. I took a breath and felt excitement rise up clean, untainted by dread. It had been a long time since an event felt like a door opening rather than a test I could fail. Out in the garden, the wind moved through grasses in a low, even whisper. For the first time, I believed that what was coming next would belong to me because I had built it that way.
Opening day in Palm Springs began before sunrise. The desert was cool and blue, the mountains an ink silhouette. I walked the courtyard with the GC, steam rising from our coffee cups, and listened to the building wake up. Air handlers hum into balance, doors whisper on new hinges, a single laugh from housekeeping echoed down the hall like a bell. By 7, the crews were gone, and the hotel staff had taken over. Front desk polishing the last fingerprints off the stone, a bartender slicing limes with the focus of a surgeon, a housekeeper smoothing a duvet until the light fell like water across it. The lobby smelled faintly of cypress and citrus. A soft track thrummed underneath it all, barely there. Marcus arrived in a linen suit that looked like it had been made for this light. He took it in quietly. The geometry, the air, the way the shadows scalloped across the floor. "It breathes," he said at last, exactly like we hoped. We did the final pass, the one that isn't about inspection so much as respect. A plant was nudged 3 inches, a chair was angled toward a view that people didn't know they wanted yet. We stepped back, nodded, and let the space be itself. By twilight, guests flowed in like they belonged. Owners, local officials, the kind of media that notices the right things. Craftspeople who'd built what no one else could build. Strings played under the courtyard arcade. The sky went honey gold, then rose. We skipped a ribbon cutting. I hate the grandiosity of scissors. Marcus took the small platform under the jacaranda and spoke plainly about the team, about making something that honored a place instead of conquering it. He thanked my studio by name. Then he looked at me and gestured me forward. I don't love microphones, but the moment didn't ask for a speech so much as a truth. Buildings carry what we ask them to carry, I said, keeping it short. If we design them with honesty and respect, they hold, they last. I'm grateful to every hand that touched this project. And I paused, the lump in my throat brief and not unwelcome. To the man who taught me to build things that matter. This one's for my grandfather. It wasn't more than a minute. It was enough. Someone clapped first, then everyone. The strings picked up a brighter song. Servers moved through the garden with trays that smelled like grilled stone fruit and rosemary.
A journalist with smart eyes asked a few thoughtful questions about shade and airflow, about choosing local materials over imported gloss. I answered simply, I've learned that jargon is the enemy of meaning. We talked briefly about artisans whose names should be on the plaque as much as mine. She smiled and said she'd write it that way. The team found me near the bar, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, in that way people look when they know they've done good work. We toasted with something cold. I said thank yous with names and specifics. The interiors lead who argued for the indigo at exactly the right moment. The PM who wrangled a shipment out of customs with nothing but patience and relentless email. The junior who spotted a misaligned reveal at framing and saved us all a headache. It felt right to say it out loud. Later, I slipped away to the roof terrace. The desert night had its own music, low conversation drifting up, glass clinks like far-off chimes, a faint buzz from a transformer down the block. The pool glowed like an opal. The mountains were ink again. I leaned on the parapet and let the air move across my skin. My phone buzzed. Sterling, Charleston permits issued. VI procurement cleared customs. All systems go. I texted back a simple line. Thank you for everything. He replied with the sentence that read like him. The structure stands because you designed it to. I thought, briefly, of the woman at the plaza standing next to a marble column with a glass of flat champagne. She felt very far away, not erased, just placed where she belonged. In the past. Recorded, learned from, finished. Marcus found me and handed me a soda with lime. The board wants to add 2 more properties to the pipeline, he said, almost apologetic, but only if you have the bandwidth. I laughed and told him we'd talk Monday, because tonight wasn't about spreadsheets. It was about air moving the way you hoped it would when you drew it. Back in my room, I emptied my pocket onto the nightstand. Room key, a folded seating chart with pencil notes, a small piece of desert stone I'd picked up off the site months ago and kept like a talisman. I set the stone next to a glass of water. It looked right there. Simple, true, unpretentious. It was a good endnote to a day built from the same materials. I slept with the sliding door cracked and woke once to look out at a line of light along the ridge. For a second, the work hummed through me like a current, not adrenaline, not anxiety, purpose. In the morning, I'd drive back to LA, kiss Miss Jenkins on the cheek, and walk the Charleston team through a port sequence I wanted to soften by 3 inches. I'd call the metalsmith about the Virgin Islands hinges and send a note to the basket weaver whose work turned a corridor into a story. The rhythm would resume. For now, I let the room go still and felt the quiet that follows when you set something down and don't pick it up again. The week after Palm Springs, the studio didn't let itself float on praise. Monday morning at 9, we were pinning up Charleston revisions and arguing delightfully about 3 inches of porch depth, like those inches were the difference between hospitality and theater. In the Virgin Islands, our metalsmith hinges arrived, their swings so satisfyingly smooth that someone gasped, and the basket weaver sent a photo of a long corridor warmed by her work. My inbox filled with interviews I mostly declined. The ones I took were the kind that asked about process and people instead of inspiration in the abstract. I said the same true things in different words. Listen to the place, hire craftspeople who know things your software never will, design for air and light first, then everything else. A journalist tried to bait me into talking about the plaza. I smiled into the phone and said, "Old story. I'm busy writing new ones." At home, routines deepened their roots. Miss Jenkins started bringing cuttings from her garden and taught me to coax a stubborn rosemary back from the brink. The house had moods now. Morning light that poured like honey down the stair, late afternoon quiet that smelled of tea and sawdust, night settling softly as the garden lights pulsed on one by one. Eliza Kincaid's painting kept catching me off guard with new paths through its storm. Sterling's Thursday call was brief as always. Permits are dancing when they should. Corporate filings are asleep. Accounts are boring. He paused. "How's the work?" I said, "Alive," and meant it. A card arrived in the mail, thick and simple. No return address, handwritten, "You were right. I'm trying." No money asked, no apology demanded. The signature was a first name that could have been anyone's. I slid it into a drawer without deciding what it meant and let it sit there, like an unanswered question that didn't require a response. On a rain-washed Tuesday, I took the afternoon and drove to the beach with a thermos of tea and a stack of prints.
I spread them out on a picnic table, weighed the corners with shells, and traced a porch sequence with my finger, imagining a guest pausing where the air cools before stepping into a lobby that feels like an embrace, not an announcement. When the drizzle turned to real rain, I packed up and sat in the car, listening to it stitch the world together. Charleston's framing day hit like a small holiday. The crew hoisted a beam that glided into place with the kind of inevitability that happens only when 6 small decisions were good ones. Someone whooped. We clapped. Then we went back to work. In the evening, I walked down King Street with the PM and we split a slice of pie that tasted like childhood. "This is the good part," she said, tapping the wrapper. "When it all starts to look like what you drew." Back in LA, I met Marcus for coffee in a sunlit corner near the Arts District. He slid a folder across the table with 2 tabs flagged. "2 more sites in early feasibility," he said, a little sheepish. "Only if you want them." "I'll say yes on Monday," I said, laughing. "Tonight I'm pretending I have boundaries." We talked about vendors who made miracles out of backlogs, about budgets that behaved because respect had been baked into them from the start. Before we left, he said, offhand and earnest, "The board's tired of glossy. They want honest. Keep doing that." That night, the house held a dinner that wasn't a performance. Takeout containers opened, real plates used, candles lit not for show, but because the light was kind. A junior from the studio brought her girlfriend. Miss Jenkins stayed and told a ridiculous story about a neighbor's cat who had learned to ring a doorbell. We laughed hard enough to wipe our eyes. No one mentioned last names. No one kept score.
Later, alone on the terrace, I phoned my mother and we talked about small things. Her basil, my rosemary, a pair of shoes she refused to confess the price of. When we hung up, I stared at the city and felt the exact opposite of what I'd felt standing by that marble column. This was inclusion, chosen and mutual, not proximity to power. Before bed, I pulled out my grandfather's letter from the safe, the one that wasn't legalese. Just a page in his awkward hand. "Build what matters. Don't let anyone rent space in your head for free. Be kind. Be exact." I slid it back into its envelope and returned it to its place. The safe door closed with a satisfying thud. Work would continue. Punch list, budgets, quiet miracles, and the occasional well-placed no. The house would be just the right amount of messy on weekends. Miss Jenkins would hum, Sterling would call. The garden would grow into itself. The person I'd been, trying to earn a seat at a table that was always going to be pulled out from under me, felt like someone I could love without wanting to be again. I didn't pity her. I thanked her. She had done the best she could with what she knew. Then she learned more. Palm Springs glowed on my calendar as done. Charleston and the Virgin Islands ticked forward. I went to sleep thinking about a handrail detail and woke up smiling because the solution had come while I dreamed. 3 inches, a softened edge, a term that invited the hand naturally. The kind of small answer that makes a big difference when you get it right. Sometimes this is what redemption looks like. Not a headline or a door slamming, but the right radius on a piece of wood your palm will love every time it meets it. 6 months later, opening night didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like a good, deep breath. The Virgin Islands project glowed under a sky freckled with stars. Trade winds moved through the palms like a chorus. The courtyard lanterns threw soft ellipses of light onto coral stone. The louvered shutters clicked faintly, doing the job we'd asked them to do. Musicians under the arcade eased steel pan notes through the air, and the place smelled faintly of salt and lime. The team gathered, sunburned, proud, their dress shoes still dusty from a last sight walk. Marcus's board arrived in linen and restraint. The artisans, basket weavers, carpenters, tile makers, stood shoulder to shoulder with us, faces open. That mattered most. There was no ribbon. I don't do ribbons. Marcus took a small mic and kept it brief. Gratitude for a project that chose place over pretense, thanks to the people whose hands made it so. He gestured to the plaque by the door where every craftsperson's name sat beside ours. He looked at me, and a ripple of attention moved across the courtyard. I stepped up, not to give a speech, but to tell a truth. Buildings remember what we ask of them, I said.
voice steady. We asked this one to hold shade and breeze, stories and welcome. Thank you to everyone who answered that ask. And to the person who taught me that what you build is who you are, this one's for my grandfather. It took a minute to say. It felt like enough. The applause rose and settled like tide. Servers threaded through with tiny plates that tasted like the islands. The lobby breathed exactly as we drew it. Later, on a balcony that looked out at a dark horizon line, I held a glass of cold water and let the wind knead my shoulders. Down in the courtyard, someone laughed the kind of laugh you only hear when the work is right. My phone buzzed once. Sterling. Charleston TCO issued. VI CFO signed. All clean. I typed a smile into the glass and put the phone back in my pocket.
I thought of the 19-year-old in a hospital room promised a set of tools and a standard to keep. Of the woman at the plaza standing beside a marble column with a flat glass in her hand. Of the person who designed the demolition plan in a studio full of tracing paper and quiet. They were all me. I was proud of all of them. Back in LA, the house had become exactly what I hoped. Beautiful because it worked. Miss Jenkins had a way of appearing with tea at the moment my brain went static. The studio thrummed without burning out. The garden grew into itself. Work kept insisting on its own rhythm. Permits and punch lists, mistakes and fixes, the miracle of a beam that lands right the first time, the ordinary heroics of a life built carefully. As for Devin, I didn't follow the plot. I sent the one check I decided on and closed that account, emotionally and otherwise. I hadn't ruined him. I had revoked access that was never his and returned the inheritance to its purpose, to build what matters, not bankroll entitlement. If he ever builds something real, I hope his hands will remember that it's possible. People ask me what the turning point was. They expect a dramatic image, the eviction notice, the emergency board vote. The truth is smaller and truer. It was the moment I believed my own ledger more than someone else's story. The moment the documents in a black folio felt heavier than a room full of titles. The moment I decided to stop renting out my self-respect to keep anyone comfortable. Did I give him a second chance? In a way, just not the kind he wanted. I offered him the clean boundary of consequence and the means to start over on his own 2 feet. I protected my grandfather's legacy and finally, my own. Was it worth it? Every measured step, every signature, every quiet morning I now get to spend designing instead of explaining myself. Every night I sleep through.
This isn't a revenge story. It's a foundation story. The life I'm building holds because the footings are truth and respect. And because when the structure showed hidden rot, I had the nerve to take it down and start again. So I'll ask you, did I go too far or did I finally go far enough? If this story resonated, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. If you like more stories like this, please subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And if you want to support the work, a super thanks truly helps me keep creating. On screen, you'll see 2 more life stories I highly recommend. There's a lot more waiting on the channel. With love and respect, see you in the next one.